Hi, today I'll be talking about a paper in which I try to infer some metadata from names, especially around race and ethnicity. This is joint work with Suryan. So the first question we want to ask is, why do we want to learn from names? And the answer for me is that sometimes when you're trying to answer important questions, names is all the data. Name is all the data that you have. For example, if we wanted to ask, what kind of people are covered in the media, is it whites, blacks, men, or women in the news media, then you really will have in the news media just names. I'll give you an example of that. That is, you see these two names, that was Robin Moeller, Richard P. Barr. We want to actually get metadata on them to be able to answer a substantive question about whether men or women or, say, whites or blacks, for example, are covered more or less often in the media. There are 4 or 5 broad reasons why we want to think about learning from names. They come down to highlighting biases. That's an example I gave. We want to find these biases, and then we also want to prevent them. So, by regressing out, for example, these kinds of dimensions. And then personalization is another one, where we can actually use these methods. So concretely, if we were asking biases in media coverage, which is an example I've already given, you want to get the metadata, fairness in lending again. We want to get this data to be able to see whether we are lending in a fair way. Political accountability questions also, who donates to whom, whose emails are read. I think we need to again have metadata on names. So while, we have covered why learn from names, but there is a corresponding question about why not learn from names. Because we fear that these things can be used as instruments for discrimination. My thinking about this question is that more data allows us to hold other people accountable. But in the end, I think this is still a concern that we really want to think through and be careful about and continue to monitor how this is used. So if we were to learn from names, how would we? We could do this, that is P ethnicity given name, and classify to the majority class. And there is, this is the base optimal classifier. For the census last name data set, which has a race for 1,000 most common last names, which looks like, as follows. We can easily do this, but the problem is that we just have 1,000 most common last names. But really, the domain of last names is actually more like 160K last names. So, and then we want to ask questions about where we have more than the last name, how would we do this? For example, African Americans have more distinctive first names. Could we exploit this information to make that classification a bit better? Similarly, when people have minor variations in the names and how they spell the names, or can we exploit geographic variation, for example, and how names are spelled or whatever. So how do you capitalize on the opportunities? There is a very generic NLP sort of method, which is, where we're kind of exploiting bicars. You could also exploit actually communication networks, which exploit the fact that people generally talk to same race people in the emails. So the generic NLP workflow is text embeddings classifier. I'm going to elide over that because of limited time. So in our case, it is embeddings of common bicars, and then we apply LSTM on top. There is a great question about how do we, what do we mean about the Y variable? And really the short answer for us is, what do people choose when asked to force fit into administrative categories? That's the answer we are choosing, but it is a limited answer. The data we're using is voting registration data from Florida, and race and ethnicity is split into 4 categories. We also have Wikipedia data, but I'm not going to be talking about that today. So when you see the success using Florida voter registration data, you see that non-Hispanic blacks, with just last name alone, you have an F1 score, which is 0.32, but with the full name, you have actually 0.22 higher, which is about 0.55. The application I'll be discussing is donations to political campaigns in 2010 by race and ethnicity. The underlying concern is that if whites contribute, for example, a larger share of political donations, are politicians actually motivated to represent them more often than if you will, than than African Americans or Hispanics who don't contribute as much, say. So we find that Hispanics are the key sort of group, if you will, among the four who are actually, where the share of the contributions is far less, if you will, than I would say, than what they make, than the proportion that they're contributing, to political campaigns. And this may have some implications in terms of representation. Thank you again for listening to me.